If Mr. Hale signs that contract tonight, his company won't survive the year. The words barely made it past Evelyn Carter's trembling lips as rainwater dripped from the edge of her coat onto the polished marble floor of Hale Global's lobby. Around her, people kept moving like she didn't exist. Executives in $1,000 suits brushed past without looking at her face. The giant LED screen above the reception desk flashed bright silver letters across the room. Hale Global announces historic $3 billion merger. The image of Richard Hale filled the screen beneath it, sharp jaw, silver tie, cold blue eyes that always looked like they were studying numbers instead of people. Evelyn tightened her grip on the thick stack of documents pressed against her chest. The corners of the pages were bent from the rain. Her breathing still hadn't slowed from the 12-block sprint she'd made through downtown Chicago traffic after discovering the clause buried inside the merger files. "Ma'am, you can't stand here." The security guard's voice came flat and rehearsed. Evelyn looked up quickly. "I need to get upstairs. Right now." The older guard barely glanced at her visitor badge before shaking his head. "Board meetings private." "Please," she said softly. "Someone made a mistake in the contract." He gave a tired sigh, the kind people gave when they already decided you weren't important enough to interrupt their evening. Legal team already checked everything. Evelyn swallowed hard. That was exactly what terrified her. Because she had checked it too. 3 times. And every time, the same sentence sat there hidden beneath layers of polished legal language like a knife wrapped in velvet. Liability transfer upon regulatory review. 1 line. 1 signature. 1 disaster waiting quietly behind expensive smiles. The elevator doors opened nearby with a soft chime. 4 executives stepped out laughing about dinner reservations while an assistant hurried behind them balancing coffee trays. Nobody noticed Evelyn standing there soaked from the storm with panic written across her face. Nobody except a young janitor mopping near the hallway. He looked at the papers in her hands, then at the fear in her eyes. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Evelyn forced a small nod she didn't feel. "I hope so." 38 floors above her, Richard Hale sat at the center of a black marble conference table surrounded by city lights, and people too afraid to disagree with him. The merger documents rested neatly beside his hand, waiting for a signature worth billions. Evelyn knew men like Richard Hale never noticed girls like her. Girls with tired sneakers. Girls who sorted files in basement archive rooms while executives drank bourbon under chandelier lights. To people like him, she was background noise. Invisible. But invisible people saw things others missed. Her phone buzzed violently in her coat pocket. Another ignored email notification. Subject: urgent contract issue. No replies. No acknowledgement. Nothing. Evelyn stared at the elevator numbers climbing higher and felt her heartbeat thudding against the documents in her arms. If she walked away now, nobody would blame her. Nobody would even remember she was there. But somewhere above her, a billionaire was seconds away from destroying his own empire without even realizing it. And Evelyn Carter was the only person in the building willing to stop him. The elevator numbers climbed painfully slow. 12, 14, 16. Evelyn Carter kept staring at the glowing panel above the doors while water dripped from the sleeve of her gray coat onto the carpet below. Her fingers tightened around the merger documents so hard the paper edges pressed into her skin. Somewhere between the 17th and 18th floor, her reflection caught in the brushed steel wall beside her. Tired eyes. Damp curls clinging near her forehead. A visitor badge hanging crooked against her sweater with the words Temp Archive Clerk printed in fading black letters. Nobody looking at her would have guessed she once ranked top of her class in corporate law. Nobody looking at her now would imagine she spent nights studying legal journals online from a tiny apartment above a laundromat on West Monroe Street. Life had a way of shrinking people quietly. 3 years earlier, Evelyn had stood inside a university lecture hall with polished wood walls and sunlight pouring through 20-foot windows while professors called her one of the brightest legal minds they had seen in years. Then her father died during a warehouse collapse on the South Side, and everything changed faster than she could breathe. Tuition disappeared. Her mother's medical bills stacked higher every month. Dreams became luxuries people talked about on television. Survival became louder. The elevator chimed softly at floor 26. 2 executives entered without acknowledging her existence. One of them smelled like expensive cologne and rain-soaked wool. The other scrolled through stock updates on his phone while speaking under his breath. Hale is going to dominate the market after tonight. Evelyn looked down at the documents again. Her stomach twisted. They had no idea. The hidden clause sat buried on page 47 like poison beneath crystal water. So carefully written. So professionally disguised. Most people would never notice the wording shift. But Evelyn noticed because her father used to teach her something every Sunday night while repairing old radios at their kitchen table. People hide truth inside complicated language when they do not want ordinary folks to ask questions. She could still hear his voice sometimes. Warm, calm, steady like old jazz records spinning late at night. Her father never finished college, but he understood people better than most executives ever would. Evelyn swallowed hard as the memory faded. The elevator finally reached the 48th floor. The doors slid open to silence, so polished it almost felt expensive. Dark marble stretched beneath soft recessed lighting. Massive windows overlooked downtown Chicago glowing silver through the storm. At the end of the hallway stood two assistants outside the boardroom doors, both holding tablets against their chests. One looked up immediately when Evelyn approached. Delivery staff uses the service entrance downstairs, the woman said without smiling. Evelyn caught her breath. I am not delivery staff. The assistant's eyes flicked toward the soaked papers in Evelyn's arms and then toward her badge. The meeting already started. I know. Then you should. No, nobody enters once Mr. Hale begins negotiations. Evelyn glanced toward the closed walnut doors. Through the thick glass, she could barely hear distant voices and the occasional low laugh. Billion-dollar decisions happening just feet away, while the one person trying to stop a disaster stood outside, looking like she did not belong in the building at all. The assistant folded her arms. Miss, I am going to need you to leave. Evelyn looked down at page 47 one more time. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She imagined Richard Hale signing the contract. Headlines. Federal investigations. Thousands of employees losing jobs. An empire collapsing because nobody bothered listening to the quiet girl carrying documents through the rain. Then suddenly, from inside the boardroom, came the sound of chairs shifting and someone saying clearly, "Bring the signature copies." Evelyn lifted her eyes toward the doors. And before fear could stop her, she reached for the handle. The moment Evelyn pushed open the boardroom door, every voice inside stopped. The room stretched wide beneath soft amber lighting and floor-to-ceiling windows streaked with rain. A 48-foot conference table cut through the center like a runway of polished black stone. Men and women in tailored suits turned slowly toward her with identical expressions of confusion and irritation. At the far end sat Richard Hale. His silver cufflinks caught the light as he lowered a fountain pen onto the contract in front of him. Calm blue eyes lifted toward Evelyn for barely half a second before moving away again, like she was another interruption someone else should handle. Who let her in? One executive muttered under his breath. Evelyn's pulse hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. Water dripped quietly from the hem of her coat onto the carpet, while every face in the room waited for security to remove her. But she stepped forward anyway, clutching the documents tightly against her chest. Sir, she said, her voice thinner than she wanted. You cannot sign that agreement. A sharp silence spread across the room. One woman near the center table actually laughed softly in disbelief. Richard Hale leaned back slightly in his chair. And you are? His tone was not angry. Somehow that made it worse. Cold. Detached. The kind of voice people used when they already decided your words had no value. Evelyn swallowed. Evelyn Carter. Archive Department. Archive Department. Another executive repeated with amusement. Richard glanced toward the legal team seated beside him. I assume someone forgot to secure confidential documents. The room chuckled quietly. Heat climbed into Evelyn's face, but she forced herself to keep standing. There is a liability transfer hidden in subsection C on page 47, she said carefully. If the merger goes through under current language, Hale Global absorbs all future regulatory exposure. Several people exchanged brief looks. One attorney frowned faintly, but said nothing. Then Vanessa Cole finally stood from her seat near the center of the table. Tall, precise, perfectly composed in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Evelyn's monthly rent. Vanessa walked toward her slowly, high heels tapping against the marble floor like a countdown clock. Miss Carter, she said with a polished smile that never reached her eyes. This room contains people with decades of legal and financial experience. Evelyn nodded once. I understand. Then you also understand this merger has already been reviewed by 3 firms and approved by every department necessary. Yes, ma'am, but they missed the revised wording. Vanessa's smile disappeared completely. You are embarrassing yourself. The words landed softly, but they cut through the room sharper than shouting ever could. Richard Hale finally looked directly at Evelyn again, though not with curiosity. More like mild exhaustion. Miss Carter, he said calmly. People in your position often mistake confidence for expertise. Evelyn felt every eye watching her, waiting for her to shrink, waiting for her to apologize and leave. Her fingers trembled slightly against the papers. But then she remembered her father standing at their old kitchen table years ago beneath a flickering light bulb, teaching her how contracts worked using overdue utility bills and newspaper clippings. The dangerous deals, he used to say, are always the ones dressed up to look safe. Evelyn slowly stepped closer to the table. Sir, she said quietly, I am asking you to read page 47 before you sign. Vanessa immediately reached for the documents in Evelyn's arms. That is enough. The sudden movement caused several pages to slip loose from Evelyn's hands. White paper scattered across the dark marble floor like fallen snow. A few executives looked away awkwardly. Nobody bent down to help her. For one painful second, the entire room stayed silent except for the distant sound of thunder rolling across the Chicago skyline outside. Then Richard Hale picked up his pen again. The silver pen hovered inches above the signature line, while rain crawled down the massive windows behind Richard Hale like thin rivers of mercury. Nobody in the room moved. Nobody breathed loudly enough to disturb the tension tightening through the air. Evelyn slowly lowered herself to the marble floor and gathered the scattered pages one by one. Her damp fingers shook slightly, but her expression stayed calm, quiet, controlled. The kind of control people learned only after life embarrassed them enough times in public. Vanessa Cole watched her with visible irritation. Security is on the way, she said flatly. You should leave before this becomes worse for you. Evelyn looked up from the papers. It already becomes worse for all of us if he signs. A few executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Someone near the far end of the table muttered, This is unbelievable. Richard Hale remained perfectly still in his chair, one hand resting near the contract while the skyline reflected cold blue light across his face. He had spent 20 years building Hale Global into one of the largest financial firms in the country. Newspapers called him ruthless. Investors called him brilliant. Employees called him terrifying when he could not hear them. Men like Richard Hale survived because they trusted systems, numbers, and power, not frightened young women from archive departments interrupting billion-dollar mergers. Miss Carter, he said finally, his voice low and precise, do you honestly believe an entire legal division overlooked something only you discovered? Evelyn finished collecting the last page before standing again. No, sir, she answered softly. I believe somebody hoped nobody important would notice. The room went still again. One of the senior attorneys shifted in his seat. Another reached quietly for the contract copy in front of him. Vanessa folded her arms tighter. That accusation is dangerously irresponsible. Evelyn looked directly at Richard. Please read subsection C yourself. Richard's jaw tightened almost invisibly. He disliked being challenged, especially publicly, especially by someone society taught him not to notice. He glanced toward his chief legal officer, Martin Graves, a gray-haired attorney who had worked corporate mergers since before Evelyn was born. Martin, the older man adjusted his glasses calmly. We reviewed the final draft yesterday evening. Then read it again, Evelyn said before fear could stop her. Vanessa turned sharply. You do not interrupt senior counsel. Evelyn swallowed hard, but kept speaking. The wording changed in revision 4. The liability structure shifts after regulatory review. Martin frowned faintly. For the first time since Evelyn entered the room, uncertainty flickered across someone's face. He opened the contract slowly, fingers turning pages beneath the amber light. 42, 43, 44. The sound of paper sliding against paper suddenly seemed louder than the storm outside. Richard Hale watched him silently now. The room no longer felt amused. It felt cautious. Evelyn could sense it changing inch by inch. Martin reached page 47. His eyes moved across the text once. Then again, his forehead creased slightly. Vanessa noticed immediately. Martin. He did not answer right away. The older attorney leaned closer toward the page, lips tightening as he reread the paragraph beneath subsection C. Richard set his pen down completely this time. What is it? Martin removed his glasses slowly. The silence stretching across the boardroom no longer felt irritated. It felt heavy, dangerous. Finally, the attorney spoke, but his voice had lost all confidence. This clause was not in the previous draft. Vanessa stepped forward immediately. That is impossible. Martin turned the contract toward her. The regulatory liability transfers to Hale Global 6 months after merger completion. One executive sat back heavily in his chair. Another whispered something under his breath that nobody answered. Evelyn stood motionless beside the conference table, soaked coat dripping quietly onto the marble floor, while every powerful person in the room stared at the page she had begged them to read. Richard Hale reached slowly for the contract himself. And for the first time since she entered the boardroom, he looked at Evelyn Carter like she actually existed. Richard Hale read the paragraph once in silence. Then again more slowly. The storm outside deepened, rain striking the glass walls in soft waves while the lights of downtown Chicago shimmered through the darkness below. Nobody in the boardroom spoke anymore. The earlier amusement had disappeared completely. Now the room felt cold in a different way. Careful. Richard's eyes stayed fixed on the contract while one finger rested beside the exact sentence Evelyn had pointed out. The transfer language was subtle, elegant even, written carefully enough that most executives would skim past it without concern. But once seen, it could not be unseen. Martin Graves cleared his throat quietly. If this agreement had been executed tonight, Hale Global would assume full legal responsibility for future compliance investigations tied to the merger. One executive whispered, "Dear God." Another leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand across his mouth as if trying to wake himself from a bad dream. Vanessa Cole stepped closer to the table, disbelief hardening across her face. There must be another draft version. There is not, Martin replied quietly. This is the final signature copy. Richard finally lifted his eyes from the document. His expression remained controlled, but something underneath it had shifted. The kind of shift powerful men tried very hard never to show publicly. He looked toward Evelyn standing alone near the end of the table, damp curls still clinging to her forehead, coat sleeves darkened with rainwater. A young woman everyone in the room had dismissed less than 5 minutes earlier. How did you find this? He asked. Evelyn hesitated briefly. I organize archived revisions in the basement records department. I noticed subsection wording changed between version 3 and version 4. Vanessa folded her arms tightly. That still does not explain why nobody else caught it. Evelyn looked down for a second before answering carefully. Because everybody trusted the summary pages instead of reading the language itself. The words landed heavier than she intended. Several people avoided eye contact immediately. Richard leaned back slowly in his chair. His silver tie loosened slightly near the collar now. The first visible imperfection anyone in the room had probably seen on him in years. Who approved revision 4? He asked quietly. Nobody answered right away. Martin flipped through additional pages while tension crawled across the room like static electricity before a lightning strike. Then the attorney stopped suddenly. His face tightened. Revision 4 was submitted externally at 11:22 last night. Vanessa stepped forward sharply. By whom? Martin looked up slowly. The acquisition consulting team from Vayner Capital. A long silence followed. Richard's jaw flexed once. Everyone in the financial world knew Vayner Capital had pushed aggressively for this merger from the beginning. Too aggressively, maybe. Evelyn watched realization spread quietly across the room. Executives began whispering under their breath. Assistants checked phones nervously. One board member removed his glasses entirely and stared out at the storm as though trying to understand how close they had all come to disaster. Richard remained silent the longest. Then finally he stood. The movement alone changed the energy of the room immediately. He walked slowly around the conference table toward Evelyn while polished leather shoes echoed softly against the marble floor. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody moved. Evelyn felt her heartbeat climbing again as he stopped only a few feet away. Up close, Richard Hale looked older than the magazines ever showed him. Not weaker, just tired in a way money could not fix. He studied Evelyn carefully now, like he was seeing details his eyes skipped over before. The soaked sleeves, the trembling hands trying to stay still, the exhaustion beneath her calm expression. "You sent emails earlier today," he said quietly. Evelyn nodded once. "3 of them." Martin looked startled. Vanessa immediately turned toward one of the assistants. "Check the legal inbox." The assistant's fingers moved rapidly across her tablet before her face lost color. They were flagged as low priority. Silence crushed the room again. Richard glanced toward the windows where lightning flashed pale white across the skyline. Then he looked back at Evelyn Carter, the quiet archive clerk nobody important had noticed until she walked through the storm carrying the truth in her hands. The boardroom emptied slowly after midnight. One by one, executives disappeared into private calls and emergency meetings while the storm outside softened into steady rain against the glass tower. The merger had been suspended indefinitely. Lawyers remained on lower floors reviewing every document connected to Vayner Capital. Somewhere deep inside the building, panic had quietly replaced confidence. But on the 48th floor, silence finally settled over the room like fog. Evelyn stood alone near the windows, gathering the remaining papers from the conference table. The adrenaline that carried her through the night had begun fading, leaving behind only exhaustion. Her shoulders ached. Her shoes were still damp from the rain. The city below shimmered in blurred silver reflections beneath low clouds and distant headlights. She carefully stacked the documents into neat piles the same way she always organized records in the archive basement. Quiet work. Invisible work. The kind nobody noticed unless something went wrong. Behind her, the boardroom doors opened softly. Richard Hale stepped back inside alone. His suit jacket hung loosely over one shoulder now, tie slightly undone, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal tiredness instead of power. For several seconds he said nothing. He simply watched Evelyn arranging papers beneath the dim amber light. The same young woman security probably would have removed an hour earlier if she had not forced her way into the room. Evelyn sensed him there before turning around. "I can leave now," she said quietly. Richard shook his head once. "No." The single word hung strangely in the empty room. Softer than before. He walked slowly toward the windows overlooking Chicago while thunder rolled faintly somewhere beyond the skyline. "Do you know," he said after a moment, "how many people sat at this table tonight?" Evelyn glanced toward the empty leather chairs. "A lot. 32 executives. 7 attorneys. 2 outside consulting firms." He paused briefly. "And somehow the only person who actually protected this company works in archive storage." Evelyn lowered her eyes toward the papers in her hands. "I was just doing my job." Richard let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like disbelief. "No," he said. "Most people protect themselves first." The room fell silent again except for the soft hum of air conditioning and rain tapping gently against the windows. Evelyn looked at Richard carefully now. Without the crowded boardroom around him, he seemed less untouchable somehow. Still powerful, still intimidating, but human in a way the headlines never showed. He rested one hand against the glass overlooking the city. "You said the wording changed between revisions." "Yes, sir." "And you noticed because you compare archive drafts manually?" Evelyn nodded. "The software flags formatting changes, but not intent." Richard looked back at her slowly. "How long have you worked downstairs?" "Almost 11 months. "And before that?" Evelyn hesitated. "Law school." Something flickered across his expression. "You left?" "My father passed away." Her voice stayed calm, but softer now. "My mother got sick a few months later. I needed income more than tuition." Richard stared at her for a long moment without speaking. Somewhere below them, a siren echoed faintly through the wet streets of downtown Chicago. Evelyn returned to stacking the contracts because it felt easier than standing still beneath his attention. Then suddenly Richard noticed something sitting partially exposed inside the folder she carried. A worn legal textbook with highlighted pages and handwritten notes crowded into the margins. The cover edges were frayed from use. He picked it up carefully. "Corporate regulatory structures." "You still study?" he asked. Evelyn gave a small shrug. "At night mostly." Richard flipped through several pages silently. Yellow sticky notes marked entire sections. Tiny handwritten corrections lined the margins beside printed case studies. Hours and hours of work hidden inside a book nobody important had ever bothered noticing. Richard closed the textbook slowly. Then he looked at Evelyn Carter again. Not like an archive clerk, not like background noise in a billion-dollar building, but like someone whose mind had been overlooked simply because the world decided she belonged somewhere quieter. By 2:15 in the morning, most of Hale Global's executive floor looked nothing like it had a few hours earlier. The polished confidence that usually filled the building had cracked beneath emergency legal reviews, canceled calls, and quiet panic spreading floor by floor. Assistants hurried through hallways carrying revised contracts while conference rooms glowed deep into the night. But inside Richard Hale's office, everything felt strangely still. Evelyn sat carefully at the edge of a leather chair across from his desk, her damp coat folded neatly beside her. A fresh cup of coffee rested untouched near her hands. Steam curled upward into the soft light, while Chicago shimmered silently through the glass behind Richard. He stood near a long walnut shelf lined with awards and framed magazine covers bearing his name. Forbes, Fortune, Business Weekly. Every headline praised his instincts, his intelligence, his ability to see risk before anyone else. Tonight, one unknown archive clerk had seen what he did not. Richard loosened his tie further and looked toward the city. Martin finished the internal review 10 minutes ago, he said quietly. Evelyn looked up, and Richard turned slowly toward her. The clause was intentional. The words settled heavily into the room. Evelyn lowered her eyes for a second, not surprised exactly, but saddened in. The way people become when the worst possibility proves true. Richard walked back toward his desk, holding a thin folder in one hand. Vayner Capital planned to transfer all future liability onto Hale Global after regulatory approval. 6 months later, they would walk away clean while we absorbed every investigation tied to the merger. Evelyn felt a chill move through her despite the warmth of the office. That would destroy the company. Richard nodded once, and thousands of employees with it. Silence followed. The rain outside had finally stopped now, leaving the windows streaked with silver reflections from the sleeping city below. Somewhere deep in the building, printers hummed softly through the night. Richard placed the folder carefully on the desk between them. Do you know what bothers me most? Evelyn shook her head slightly. He gave a faint smile without humor. I built this company believing intelligence was all that mattered. He glanced toward the office door. But tonight, 30 experienced executives ignored the one person actually paying attention because they decided your title mattered more than your mind. Evelyn looked down at her hands quietly. Richard studied her for another long moment before sitting across from her. When security reviewed your employee file, he said, I learned you graduated top 5% in constitutional and corporate law before leaving school. Evelyn blinked in surprise. You check my file? I check everything now. For the first time all night, something close to embarrassment crossed his face. Apparently, I should have started sooner. Evelyn almost smiled but stopped herself. Richard opened the folder slowly and slid a document across the desk toward her. She frowned slightly at the heading. Temporary Internal Consultant Authorization. Sir. Richard leaned back in his chair. I want you working directly with Martin and the legal review team until this situation is resolved. Evelyn stared at the paper like she was afraid touching it would make it disappear. I work in archives. Not anymore. Her heartbeat quickened instantly. Mr. Hale, I am not licensed yet. I did not even finish law school. Neither did some of the worst executives I ever hired, Richard answered calmly. The difference is they had confidence before competence. His eyes held steady on hers now. You had competence before anyone gave you confidence. Evelyn looked away toward the city lights because suddenly her vision blurred slightly around the edges. She thought about her father working double shifts at the warehouse until his hands cracked from winter cold. She thought about her mother asleep beside unpaid medical bills stacked on a kitchen counter. She thought about every interview where people stopped seeing potential the moment they saw her address, her skin, or the word archive attached to her name. Richard's voice softened when he spoke again. Tonight you saved this company, Miss Carter. Evelyn swallowed hard. I was just trying to do the right thing. Richard nodded slowly, almost to himself. That is exactly why you were the only one who did. 3 days later, the atmosphere inside Hale Global felt completely different. The emergency investigation had spread through every department like electricity through steel wires. Entire legal teams worked around the clock reviewing old acquisitions connected to Vayner Capital. News outlets began reporting that the merger had been paused due to internal concerns, though nobody outside the building knew how close the company had come to collapse. But down in the archive department on sublevel 2, life still moved quietly. Metal shelves stretched beneath fluorescent lights while old printers hummed softly in the background. Evelyn Carter sat alone at a small desk reviewing revised compliance reports, the same desk she had worked at for nearly a year. The only difference now was the stack of legal folders beside her carried her name on temporary consultant tags instead of archive routing labels. Even then, part of her still expected someone to walk downstairs and tell her the whole thing had been a misunderstanding. She had spent too many years being overlooked to trust sudden recognition easily. The sound of footsteps echoed through the archive hallway. Slow, deliberate. Evelyn looked up in surprise as Richard Hale appeared between the rows of filing cabinets wearing a dark charcoal coat over a simple white shirt with no tie. The Billionaire CEO looked strangely out of place beneath flickering basement lights and exposed ceiling pipes. Employees nearby immediately straightened in shock. Richard ignored them completely. His attention stayed on Evelyn. "You still come down here?" he asked quietly. Evelyn gave a small nod. "Most people do not like archive work." Richard glanced around the room. Most people also missed the biggest legal trap in company history. A few nearby employees exchanged nervous looks before quietly returning to work. Richard stepped closer to Evelyn's desk and placed a thin folder beside her keyboard. She opened it carefully. Inside sat an official reinstatement letter from Chicago Metropolitan University School of Law. Full tuition sponsorship included. Evelyn stared at the page in stunned silence. "Mr. Hale, the university board owes me several favors," he said simply. "Your records show you were less than 1 year from graduating." Evelyn looked up slowly. "You did not have to do this." Richard rested one hand lightly against the edge of the desk. "No," he admitted. "I should have done something much earlier." The words hung softly between them. Honest. Heavy. Evelyn lowered her eyes again because something about hearing regret from a man like Richard Hale felt more uncomfortable than anger ever could. "People saw me," she said quietly after a moment. "They just did not think I belonged in certain rooms." Richard nodded slowly. "I know." Evelyn looked at him carefully then. "Do you?" He gave a faint breath that almost sounded like a laugh without humor. "When I started this company, people looked at my cheap suits and Kentucky accent and assumed I was the least educated man in every meeting." He paused briefly. "Success changes how the world treats you. But before success," his eyes drifted toward the archive shelves around them, "you learn exactly how invisible people can become." Silence settled comfortably for the first time since they met. Somewhere nearby, an old copy machine clicked and buzzed beneath fluorescent lights. Richard glanced toward the legal textbook sitting open beside Evelyn's keyboard. The same worn book he noticed in his office days earlier. This time he smiled slightly. "You highlighted half the pages." Evelyn finally smiled too, small but real. "The important half." Richard studied her for another moment before speaking again. "Martin wants you upstairs full-time starting Monday." Evelyn blinked. "As what?" Richard answered without hesitation. "Junior legal analyst." The words seemed almost too large for the room. Evelyn looked down at the offer letter in her hands, then around the basement archive department where she had spent months quietly organizing documents while people passed her without learning her name. Richard noticed the hesitation in her eyes. "You earned it," he said calmly. Evelyn swallowed hard and closed the folder carefully against her chest. "My father used to tell me something," she said softly. "He said the right door eventually opens for people who keep knocking with integrity." Richard nodded once. "Sounds like a smart man." Evelyn looked toward the rows of old records stretching into the distance beneath pale, fluorescent light. Then slowly, for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe maybe her life was finally changing. Monday morning arrived wrapped in pale winter sunlight spilling across the glass towers of downtown Chicago. Hale Global stood against the skyline exactly the same as it had a week earlier, steel and mirrored windows glowing above the busy streets below. But inside the building, something subtle had changed. Employees moved differently now whenever Evelyn Carter walked through the lobby. Some nodded politely. Others stepped aside near the elevators instead of brushing past her like she was invisible. Even the security guard who stopped her on the night of the merger straightened immediately when she entered. "Morning, Miss Carter," he said with quiet respect. Evelyn gave a small smile in return and adjusted the strap of her leather bag against her shoulder. The old canvas tote she carried for months remained folded carefully inside her apartment closet beside stacks of overdue textbooks and faded archive uniforms. Upstairs on the 48th floor, sunlight reflected across polished marble floors while assistants prepared for the first executive meeting since the Billionaire investigation became public. News reports had exploded over the weekend. Regulatory agencies launched formal inquiries. Several consulting executives resigned overnight. Hale Global's stock dipped briefly before recovering once investors learned the company uncovered the fraud before signing. Most headlines praised Richard Hale's leadership for preventing corporate disaster. Only a few articles mentioned the quiet legal analyst who discovered the clause in the first place. Evelyn did not seem bothered by that. She walked through the executive hallway carrying a binder against her chest, calm and focused beneath the soft glow of morning light. But inside the boardroom, something unexpected waited for her. The conversation stopped the moment she entered. Not because people doubted her anymore. Because every executive around the table stood up. Evelyn froze slightly near the doorway, unsure what to do with 30 powerful people suddenly looking at her with something close to admiration. Martin Graves smiled faintly from beside the conference table. "Morning, counselor." A few people chuckled softly. Vanessa Cole sat near the center of the room, unusually quiet. The sharp confidence she carried days earlier had softened into something more thoughtful. When Evelyn approached the table, Vanessa rose slowly from her seat, holding a thin folder. "Miss Carter," she said carefully, "I owe you an apology." The room stayed completely silent. Vanessa lowered her eyes briefly